So I think we'll go ahead. We have a good agenda today. It's just a little bit after 2 o'clock. We are going to be using the spotlight feature here. So we're going to keep you guys on mute and we'll be communicating through chat if you need things from us and if you have questions. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'll look forward to engaging with you all today. Good afternoon. I'm Keith Fairey, the President and CEO of Wayfinders, a regional affordable housing and community development organization serving Western Massachusetts. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Before we get started with our program today, which will include a presentation from the UMass Donahue Institute, a panel discussion, and a Q&A session, I'd like you all to work with me for a moment. You must be wondering, what am I talking about here? I want you all to think with me for a moment and get ourselves in the right mindset for this discussion today. It's going to be more than just the data dump from the Donahue Institute. It's going to challenge us all to kind of think about the region. It's going to challenge us all to think about the future a bit. So I've been looking forward to engaging with you in this conversation. One which I hope will be a valuable conversation that will inform the steps we need to take for our region's near-term recovery from the pandemic and the longer-term approaches required for us to realize the goal of creating an equitable, inclusive, and economically thriving region. Envision that goal for a moment: an equitable, inclusive, and economically thriving region. What does that mean? Well, just to break it down for you from my perspective, equitable is about each of us getting what we need to survive and succeed: access to opportunity, networks, resources, and supports based on where we are and where we want to go. It's about investing in our resources to eliminate the racial, ethnic, and economic disparities identified in the study. Inclusive. Being inclusive involves an authentic and empowered participation and a true sense of belonging. That means we're meaningfully engaging all members of community throughout the process of advancing strategies to achieve equity and more. And economically thriving, a growing economy that provides living wage jobs and opportunity and other opportunities. It's about access to capital to invest in startups and small business. It's about growing and retaining our talent in the region. It's about being a community where businesses of all sizes want to be. Those words resonate. Does that sound like the region you want to live in? It does for me, and I hope it does for you. In order for us to achieve that goal, though, we must ask ourselves, what must we invest in to support our people, our coworkers, the grocery store clerk, the teachers, the nurses, the mechanics, people currently living in poverty in our region, communities of color, communities without access to broadband, our business and institutional leaders, government officials, and other stakeholders? What does that mean for them? What must they do? Who is already thriving? And what do we need to do to get everybody there? These are the fundamental questions that I think we need to be asking ourselves and thinking about as we consider the information in the study. So you thought today was just going to be about housing, and it is. But what has always been the case, and what we've learned again over the last year, is that where we live, our home, is central to our health, economic, and educational success and well-being. That's both individually and collectively. And right now, we have an amazing opportunity to pursue that goal of a thriving community, inclusive of a diverse mix of housing choices for all in our region. And the housing study comes at a perfect time to help us understand where we need to target our investments of time, capacity, and resources to secure that future. The good thing is we're not standing flat-footed here. There are many conversations already underway in our region, inside and outside government, where our housing leaders are developing strategies to harness the resources made available in the American Rescue Plan to begin this important work of investing in our future. Some of the plans and projects already exist, with efforts just needing adequate resources to bring them to scale. And optimistically, there are other real possibilities on the horizon to add to those resources via the Biden administration's proposed infrastructure bill, the FY22 budget, and more. So we must ready ourselves to seize this moment. We must think about how we use state, local, and privately held resources alongside the federal resources to achieve our goal. So as we talk about the Greater Springfield Housing Study today, we will be challenged by the data to examine some of the barriers to us becoming the thriving region I think we all want to live in. And through our conversation today, we will begin to outline a set of opportunities that are before us to invest in our communities in new ways with a new set of resources and approaches. The housing study was initially undertaken in pre-pandemic times with a regional advisory group of leaders from Hampden, Hampshire, and Franklin counties. The goal of this study was to develop a better understanding of what was happening in the housing market in the region. Were rents and prices increasing? If so, where? If rents and prices were increasing, was it pricing families out of communities? What demographic shifts were occurring in the community? And was our housing supply adequate to meet the needs of the population? All of these questions were part of the initial line of inquiry. Once the data was revealed, the plan was and is to share that for all community stakeholders to understand. So that's in part why we're all here today. And our hope now is that the data will provide some clarity about what is happening and then direct us to the issues that we need to work on and solve for, with even greater urgency given our need to recover from and build toward that goal that I've talked about. So I'm excited for us to learn together today about what the housing study reveals to us and to talk with our panel about the work we must do through housing and other means to go beyond a tepid or incomplete recovery, like the one the region had from the Great Recession, to a recovery that puts us on the path to creating an equitable, inclusive, and economically thriving region. Now we're just about ready to get started. And I have one last request, and then I'll be quiet for a little bit. During the course of the remainder of today's event, I'd like you to think about what actions you'd be willing to take to get us to our goal. From your seat, wherever that is, in whatever part of the county, in whatever part of the region, city, urban, rural, suburban, nonprofit, for-profit, we all have a role to play here. And I'll ask you again about that at the end of today's discussion about what actions you'll be willing to take to help us get to that goal. So with all that in mind, let me turn it over to our terrific research partners for the study, Mark Melnick and Gerry Bernstein from the UMass Donahue Institute, to share more about their findings and analysis. Mark and Gerry, it's all yours.
Okay, unmute myself. All right, so Keith, thanks so much for the introduction, and good afternoon to everybody that's here today. We're really excited here at the Donahue Institute to be sharing the research that we've done as part of the Greater Springfield Housing Study. It's really been an exciting process for us, and as Keith said, you know, one which I'm going to start pulling up the slide deck while I do this. And one that was a long time coming. We've been excited to be engaged in a handful of housing studies over the last few years in different parts and regions of Massachusetts. And what I think is important in talking about housing and thinking about housing is exactly the way in which Keith is framing it at the top, is the central way in which housing interacts with social mobility, community stability, and in all other elements of economic development and quality of life. And that is an evergreen issue, and one that exists in all the different parts of the Commonwealth and in the nation. And our excitement in this is that Greater Springfield is right in the Donahue Institute's backyard. Most of our staff are residents of the region or folks who are in the region often. And it's a region that hasn't really been looked at in this sort of way before. So we were super excited to be engaged in work that looks like this, and with such great partners like the folks at Wayfinders and the Community Foundation for Western Mass and others who have advised and thought through this process with us along the way. The presentation today is a small subset of a larger report that I encourage everybody here to take a look at. Keith referred, about the presentation of being a data dump. There is a dump of data that's going to take place, but it is only a part of what is inside of the larger report. And I encourage folks that if there's anything here that you don't see that you're interested in, take a look in the report because it may very well be inside of there. First, let me jump ahead and give an overview of what the project was or is. The Greater Springfield Housing Project, in all of its phases, the vision was the creation of a multi-phase, repeatable housing study for the region that looks at all manners of issues as they relate to housing. The study itself is not an affordable housing study per se, but rather one that looks at all the elements of housing and the interactions between demographic and economic trends and broader real estate trends. And in order to get it to that, we look at available data on core demographics, economic and other housing indicators, vignettes on covering other housing conditions and challenges and policy implications, with the potential for an annual or semi-annual update. The inspiration for this had been the Greater Boston Housing Report Card, and for folks in the housing space would be quite familiar with the last 20 years of housing report cards that have come out of the Boston Foundation. Has really served as a epicenter for the conversation of housing challenges as they relate to the eastern part of the state, but with the hope of trying to create a similar mechanism for the western part of the state. And as I mentioned, we've had amazing partners along the way, including Wayfinders, both with Peter Gagliardi, who helped with the putting together the project at the beginning, and then Keith picking it up over the last year. And both of their great leadership was instrumental in the work that we've done to date. The Community Foundation of Western Mass and all the volunteers who have worked as part of the Metropolitan Springfield Housing Advisory Committee. I mentioned all of its phases. The presentation that we're going to be giving today is about what we're calling phase one of the study, partly out of kind of thinking through and scoping what a housing study would look like. The decision was made early on by our team and the folks at Wayfinders and others on the advisory committee to break this project into two pieces. So the first piece of that work was looking at core secondary data that related to housing and issues related to housing in Greater Springfield. We are now we have finished that work, and that is what today's presentation is about. The plan though is to leverage that work into an ongoing study that will dive deeper into the issues of social mobility and the importance of place in terms of access to opportunity and other elements of economic growth. So in a lot of ways, I like to think about this study as, while we're presenting on phase one, I would love for this work to be looked at as a whole later, of how phase one and phase two link together. And with that, this research framework is really what drives a lot of what our thinking was over the last several months and as we move ahead. The first main pillar of how we've been thinking about this work is asking that question. So what's going on in the Pioneer Valley? For folks familiar with the region already, we know the economic recovery post the Great Recession was considerably lagged compared to the rest of the state, particularly as we think about Eastern Massachusetts. That said, the housing market began to heat up again after the crash, and it raised serious questions about affordability in the part of the state that had traditionally, at least by Massachusetts standards, been a lower cost area to live in. The valley in general is diverse, and at the same time, many parts of the valley have become less affordable for people that have historically lived here. And part of that we see is a measure of both the change in housing prices, but as Carrie will talk a little bit in her section later, the wages in the region tend to be lower than other parts of Massachusetts. Then enter COVID. The kickoff meeting for this project was actually the first week of March. I think this was the next to last meeting I had in person before COVID interrupted our lives. But it was timely in the sense that we could really integrate some of the conversation about COVID-19 into this context. And in particular, we know that the pandemic, separate from being a health crisis, was an economic one. And so the questions about who was hardest hit by this economic downturn and were central in thinking about housing instability. And we saw a ton of state and federal actions that were meant to keep people in their homes. But that kind of crisis within COVID was critical in thinking about vulnerability and community. And lastly, this third pillar for our work and how we're thinking going forward is housing as a means for social and economic mobility. Place has such a critical role in defining access to opportunity, stability of community and economic mobility. And what we found is that, and what we'll continue to research is that the pandemic has really spotlighted some of the existing vulnerabilities that were already in place. So it raises in critical questions, as Keith talks about, what the future of economic stability in the housing market is within that for our region. But COVID is both put people at greater risk, but then there's also opportunities that are presenting themselves now as we think about, to steal a phrase that's been used a lot, but building back better. So that's the framework in which we've started this work, thinking about this, both in terms of what phase 1 is and what phase 2 will be as we advance ahead in our work. The study area for this is the Pioneer Valley. We had a lot of conversations early on about what we wanted, how we wanted to think about this region and how we wanted to think about a regional housing market. For us, that was the combination ultimately of the three main counties that make up or the three counties that make up Pioneer Valley. I won't linger on that too much as we have a lot of data to get into. But in terms of the core takeaways from phase 1 in our baseline study, first on the economic and demographic side is that there were significant economic challenges that we see in the region. There's large variation across the Pioneer Valley with crises hitting poorer places harder and with slower recovery. And there are different effects of the housing market depending on whether you're an owner or renter, urban, suburban, or rural. And we see this interaction with race in the region in particular. And in Carrie's section, she'll talk more about households being stretched as it relates to their housing costs. And the income differences by race are key in understanding affordability and stability. In terms of the housing market, what we do know is that the region has been growing population slower than other parts of the state, but even with that, we project that there will be a housing supply gap in the next 5 years in the region. This is a common story in Massachusetts. While there's been a lot of effort made in recent years to increase housing production in Mass, it does not keep up with demand, and that naturally has an impact on prices. Overall, prices have generally increased pre-COVID, and we've seen prices continue to increase after COVID. The old housing stock in our region also has a risk of dilapidation, and Massachusetts and a lot of our regions have this challenge with older housing stock. And then in terms of affordability and stability, affordability continues to put pressure on different segments of the population, particularly renters. Foreclosures continued in Springfield, even in economic recovery, and rental vacancies decreased in Hamden, but tended to increase elsewhere. So just let's touching on some of the socioeconomic overview. The region itself, and in Massachusetts, we've been seeing pretty robust population growth. This graphic here looks at between 2010 and the Donahue Institute's projections for the different counties in Massachusetts out to 2030. Mass has been growing pretty well compared to other northeastern states, and we saw in the news yesterday that we'll continue to have our same congressional representation for the state. That said, a lot of the population growth and the projected population growth in the region has been eastward, with slow and sluggish population growth in other parts of the state, including Pioneer Valley. And we see in Franklin County actually a projection for us for small population decline. Carrie will address this a little bit more, but even with that, again, we do anticipate a housing shortage in the region in the coming years. One of the things that stands out about the Pioneer Valley is the elevated levels of poverty compared to the state. The graphic here looks at Massachusetts, Pioneer Valley, in each of the counties in Pioneer Valley. What we see is overall poverty is higher in Pioneer Valley. In Massachusetts, the poverty rate is around 11%. For Pioneer Valley, it's about 16%. With Hamden being up over 17%. Notably, we see elevated levels of poverty for communities of color, particularly Black and Hispanic. And in Franklin County, it's particularly high for the African-American community, but it's a very small population in the county. But focusing on areas like Hampden County, we see elevated levels of poverty for both Black and Latinx communities compared to the state overall. And this obviously has implications as it relates back to.
And then what I appreciate at the end.
The next graphic looks at the shifting unemployment rate. And here we have Massachusetts, Pioneer Valley, and Hampden County. And what's noteworthy here is, well, one, just the shock of the economic downturn tied to the COVID crisis and how much unemployment rates shot up dramatically in the spring last year. But what's also noteworthy within this is just seeing that gap that occurs for Hampden County compared in Pioneer Valley as it relates to the state overall. One of the things that drives that is the makeup of industries. And in a graphic that gets left off is just the amount of unemployment claims that were driven by food services and what we call other services, which is terribly named by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but covers a lot of things like barbershops, nail salons, massage, the types of places that require face-to-face contact. Areas that have a lot of personal service types of industries like that were areas that were hit even worse by the pandemic's economic crisis. This next graphic is just a basic infographic that looks at the folks who are most impacted by the economic downturn in terms of unemployment claims. Our graphic here looks at pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. So for example, looking on the left in the pie chart, before the pandemic, 57% of unemployment claims in the region were male, 43% female. That completely flips with the COVID crisis. And we've seen several instances of stories talking about a pink recession or a C-session. Part of this is a make of the industries that have been impacted, and part of it is also some of the family pressures that we would see on different households. What we also see is looking at race, that white folks we saw a slight increase in the makeup of white folks in the folks who were applying for unemployment in the pandemic, but in the aggregate, we see a disproportionate impact of unemployment on communities of color in the region. Non-white residents make up about 15% of the labor force in the Pioneer Valley, but proportionately, it's about twice as much that are filing for unemployment. What's left out of the graphic too is that this current downturn affected younger residents much more, where about proportionately about twice the percentage of folks 24 and under applying for unemployment than before the pandemic. And again, that's the makeup of industries, and it really targeted communities of color, women, young folks, and people with limited educational attainment. And these were also households that were more at risk pre-pandemic and maybe stretched a little bit further when it came to affording their housing. With that, I'm going to turn the show over to Carrie, and she'll dig in more on some of the housing conditions.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Carrie Bernstein. I work with Mark at the Donahue Institute in the Economic and Public Policy Research Group. I work as the State Data Center Manager in cooperative agreement with the Census Bureau and as a research manager for this project. The pandemic made this baseline that we're creating in phase one really, unfortunately, highly relevant, and we'll see where things go from here. And as Mark has shown, the systemic effects are real. Crisis hits harder for certain places and for certain folks, and we find that systemic employment issues makes the fact that makes income vary very widely by race in our region, and that's critical for housing affordability of all kinds of any housing, and differences in income between renters and owners is also crucial. So at this point, I'm just going to orient you to the rest of the presentation. I'm going to be talking about housing conditions. So we'll be looking at vacancy rates, changes, stability, looking at foreclosures, and age of housing by city and town. I know many of you who are here today have heard some of these things, have seen our report. So I'll do my best to navigate us through these things relatively quickly. For the housing market section, we'll be talking about trends in prices and housing costs compared to income. And then who is experiencing those differences. And then projections for population and showing growth and change in the population and housing units based on the past trends. So Mark already has us at vacancy rates, and that you can see owners and renters in the vacancy rates for owned and rented homes in the period that we were able to look at this information have really started to converge within their housing type. So within each of the counties, the ownership vacancy rate has converged at a very low rate. And for the rental vacancies, some of them increased for the ones that were the lowest. So for Franklin County, which had the lowest, and for Hampshire County, rental vacancy has increased from 2010 to 2018. And but if you look at, we pulled Springfield out on its own so that you could see the very high vacancy rates in 2010 coming down to a much more comparatively moderate vacancy rate in 2018 of just under 5%. And that it's closer to the Massachusetts average, and that these rental vacancy rates are converging. What that says to me is that, we were asked the question at the beginning, is the housing market changing? And to me, changes in the vacancy rates say yes. The housing market was already changing before the pandemic happened. Mark, if you could advance us to the next slide. I'm just gonna quickly touch on foreclosures, which look very different within the pandemic while we have a moratorium, but I'll remind the group that all the procedures of eviction and foreclosure moratorium are allowed to proceed except for the part where it actually concludes. So there's a potential for built up procedures to be unleashed all at once should the moratoriums conclude. So, and this data looks at the period prior to the pandemic, providing a baseline that shows foreclosures were an issue. If you look at the line graph, you can see it, that in Hampden County, foreclosures were very high. The map is done as a share of the owner-occupied housing, so that you can see that, for example, in Springfield, there was a very high rate of foreclosure, and that the trend line shows you that those things happened starting in, maybe touched off especially within the Great Recession and the housing crisis, but they continued. And after a pause in about 2013, the banks got their papers in order and started foreclosing again. And so I would say that Springfield's rate of high foreclosures has continued, and makes it especially concerning for housing stability as we end or see the end of moratoriums as the life in the pandemic is beginning to shift. Another concern on the next slide, if you don't mind advancing this, Mark, is about the age of housing, something that we'll dip into more deeply if we can access the data, is about housing conditions, but to try to dig in a little bit more about what are the starting points. Different places within the Pioneer Valley have different age of housing stock, which the newer housing stock has less opportunity to become more decrepit or beat up. And the older housing stock presents a greater risk for the people who are living within it as renters, or the people who own it who may be facing high costs to try to keep it up. So you can see that especially in Holyoke and Springfield, and also Montague, Greenfield, and Northampton, there's a really high share of pre-World War II housing stock. And depending on whether people have been able to keep up with it or not, it can present real issues with housing condition at the same time as people are facing other costs. I'm going to move us quickly now to the next section on housing market and talk a little bit about price changes. Things have been really accelerating recently, so we updated the table of data here to reflect some information that we were able to get that comes from the Realtors Association of Pioneer Valley report, but was also reported on in Mass Live. And you can see that the price change in the Pioneer Valley over year, March to March, is a 21% change. I'm of the personal belief that this is not there will be some kind of return to a different level when there is greater supply of homes on the market, because we are seeing a supply side increase of housing prices. It's possible that there's more demand coming into our region as well. And we will understand this phenomenon better, but we are seeing very high increases in home sale prices as very few homes are on the market, but there are a lot of buyers seeking. And you can see on the left is the map of where are these prices. It's a previous period. Where did the prices increase between 2012 and 2019? So prior to the pandemic, where were home sales increasing in their prices? And that includes Springfield. So again, this helps answer this initial question, is the market changing? And the answer was already yes before the pandemic began. Moving now to the next slide, if you don't mind, Mark. Thank you. It's especially important to understand rents. The graph on the right is most helpful for understanding the general trend, and we will be getting more information about what's happening to rents in the present. Data always lags behind the reality. But that's a very small subset. Those are just the rents of people leasing up using the MLS listing service, which does not include all listings. Very different picture. It's not a much more incomplete picture than we can know for the house price market. I actually see a question in the chat that says, wondering why the spike in foreclosures in Hampden County 2014 to 2015. That was when Massachusetts implemented a rule that banks needed to have a lot more documentation in a lot better order in order to foreclose. And then the banks did get those documents in order, and they resumed foreclosing again. And that's why you see a spike in that. So it's basically continuing from the highest peak, and it just happened to be a pause due to this legislative obstacle for banks. So going back to rents, we do see rents increasing everywhere except for in Franklin County from the data that we can have. That's about everybody in the ACS. So you can look at their median gross monthly rent. It includes people who have held their lease for 5, 10, 20 years. And so that's why the prices look more moderate. And we will be able to see soon whether there are rent price increases starting in the 2019 data and then eventually update. And we're definitely hearing word anecdotally that rents are beginning to change. Let's move on to the next piece, which is about thinking about the comparison between what people are able to earn where they live and how much what they're paying for housing. So when that is not well matched, that's called housing cost burden. A 30% standard is really common. It's what HUD uses as a definition. If you're paying, many of us pay more than 30% of our income for housing, but it's considered housing cost burden at 30%. And at 50%, it's considered severe housing cost burden. And because wages in the Pioneer Valley are lower than in many other parts of the state, Mark's remark that our housing may cost less compared to Boston, we still have serious problems when it comes to housing cost burden for owners and for renters, especially for renters. It's because our wages look really different here in Pioneer Valley than they do in the Boston area. So if we can advance to the next slide, we can see for whom those things are true, and you can compare us to Massachusetts as a whole. You can see there is a serious situation for housing cost burden across Massachusetts, with half of renters experiencing housing cost burden 30% of their income or more. But in the Pioneer Valley, it's even worse for renters. So, and it has not gotten better over time. And this is pre-pandemic. You can see that Franklin County looks a little better than the state, but Hampshire and Hampden counties are more challenged. And for owners, there has been there was a trend of a little bit of housing cost burden decrease over time, both in Massachusetts and across our region, but we're still talking about 30% of homeowners, or 25 to 30% of homeowners paying 30% or more of their income for housing. In the next slide, we can understand a little bit more about how this shakes out by race. And you can see that in Massachusetts, for owners and versus the Pioneer Valley, this is a complicated table because it shows several things at once, but we're able to compare the Pioneer Valley to Massachusetts as a whole, and we can see housing cost burden happening for renters especially, and those hardest hit are those who are also facing employment discrimination, including Black people and Hispanic people. And you can see that in the 53% of Black people in the Pioneer Valley experiencing housing cost burden and 56% of Hispanic people. And that is worse than it is across the state. It's also worse for people of all races who are renters across the state. So we are not exempt from the high cost of housing outpacing our wages here in the Pioneer Valley. And some of us are experiencing this even worse than others. So when we think about that vision that Keith mentioned at the top of an equitable housing situation, we are not yet at all there. So let's move now to another piece of the picture, which is understanding whether or not our number of housing units is keeping up with our population. Mark showed at the outset, there's some places where we have projected population loss. And we were able to take a straight line projection of the projected population loss or gain, and a straight line projection of how much housing is coming online and getting built and staying in the market. And if you go to the next slide, Mark, I can show that by county. So you can see this is a straight line projection, and it depends on the trends existing as they were, extending them out from 2010 on into the future. So we'll see whether the pandemic disrupts household formation, disrupts people having children, disrupts construction, and in what direction that causes these curves to change. But for the time being, the best information we have is that we expect housing unit demand to go up most in Hampden County, to go up a little in Hampshire County, and to continue to go up just a bit in Franklin County, despite the fact that their population is decreasing slightly. And the reason for that is the rate of household formation and how many housing units per person are consumed in Franklin County. The outcome of that is on the next slide. When you look over time in that projection and you see the housing unit gap, you can, we're already experiencing housing unit gap, as one of the commenter pointed out, and we are going to, back from the 2010 to 2015 straight line projection, we projected a large housing unit gap for Hampden County, moderate in Hampshire County, and still extant gap in Franklin County out into the future. So even if we kept on a status quo, we would be having a housing problem. We're expecting a housing problem. Now, we don't know what direction the pandemic will change these factors in, but if I had to guess, I would not imagine that it is going to make it better. But that is simply a guess, and we will continue to, in future years and future iterations, would be able to project again and check what is happening and what we expect to happen based on the present. The important thing about understanding the housing unit gap, which I think most people here get, is that when there's not enough supply prices go up. So if we're already in challenged position to afford the housing that we have here, this will be an additional pressure on that challenge. I'm going to turn the show back over to Mark to talk a little bit more about phase 2, and we'll take questions at the very end after the panelists.
Great, thanks, Kara. So yeah, I mentioned a bit earlier that this is a part of a 2-phase project right now. Phase 1, again, was leveraging a lot of the primary, or I should say the available secondary data that is that was at our disposal, looking at socioeconomic and real estate trends. In phase 2, we're going to explore further the relationship between racial economic disparity, the wealth divide, and housing in Pioneer Valley, and in particular, focusing on issues of segregation and opportunity in the region, barriers to homeownership, and the critical role of housing production within this story. I think one of the big takeaways for us within this work right now, and what we were framing as in phase 1, is that housing is central to economic mobility and community stability within any regional housing market. And importantly, housing markets are in fact regional. So access to location relates to our accesses to opportunity. And all the data that Gerry has outlined before, when we look at the housing market, we see how those access points look different in our region depending on who you are. And what I think is a critical thing within this story is how, while it is a challenge that can be corrected, and a big part of that is looking at ways in which production and access to communities can be enhanced throughout a regional housing market. So for us in phase 2, we'll look at those issues and weave together vignettes highlighting the important role of affordability and quality housing on quality of life and other elements of social mobility. So with that, I'll stop and turn the show back over to Keith. As Gerry noted, we look forward to questions after the panelists and hearing from the great panelists that we have here today to give perspectives on both the data, but also, conditions on the ground for folks in the housing space in the region.
Thank you, Mark and Gerry. Thanks for your ongoing work with the advisory committee and your endurance for working with us over a much longer period than we had anticipated at the outset of this work. But I feel like it is so timely right now, both us having this conversation, sharing this with our community stakeholders here, and thinking about the future together, the future that we want to have. And how do we use the study that we have today as an initial benchmark from which we measure our recovery and measure our progress in terms of getting to that goal that I talked about for our region long term. I did note in the chat there, I see there are a bunch of questions, and as Mark and Gerry said, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. We're going to get ready to move over to our panelists. Before we do that, I just do want to do one thing to share with folks here. I wanted to thank and acknowledge our advisory committee, who hopefully you can see on the screen now. These folks worked with us throughout the last year, providing their insight and input into the process. So I'm really appreciative of their efforts and engagement with us. And I also wanted to thank our funders for the first phase of the study. We continue to raise money and are close to concluding the fundraising for phase 2. And our hope and expectation is that we not only conclude the fundraising, but conclude the phase 2 part of it before the end of this year. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panelists now. And while you let all that data and analysis kind of sink in, we're going to have a bit of a conversation with some leaders from our region and who are representative of the whole Pioneer Valley here. So we were That's the diversity we were looking for in the panel, folks from across the region, active on all these issues that we talked about. And I want to thank them for being with us today and introduce them quickly and then get into hopefully a good discussion together. We have Gerry McCafferty, the Director of Housing for the City of Springfield, Linda Dunlavy, Executive Director of the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, and John Hornik, Chair of the Amherst Affordable Housing Trust. Welcome to you all and thanks for being here today. So we'll get started with the first question. And again, with the data in mind, what you already know about the needs and opportunities described in the report and your experience through your work, what do you see as the most urgent things we should be solving for in our region? Where should we make our first investments in having that will have the greatest impact? And I open it up to anybody who'd like to start here from the panel.
I'm happy to dive in.
Great, thanks, Gerry.
I'm not ready to say where we should make the investments immediately, but I think the thing that really stands out for me has stood out, and there's lots in this report that brings it home again, is as such an urgent issue in our area is racial inequality. We are one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the country. We've known that since the 2010 census data came out. And as I looked at this study, some of it was in the presentation, other pieces were in the full study, but the way in which the housing burdens fall on people of color is really apparent. Those are the cost burdens. Those are the people who are most cost burdened. They're the people who experience the most housing instability with evictions and frequent moves and homelessness. Both evictions and homelessness are places where people of color are disproportionately represented. And as in with housing conditions as well. So I think one of the things that says to me is, as we are coming out of the pandemic, and I appreciate Keith mentioning, looking at this through a lens of equity and inclusion, I think everything we're doing as we come out of the pandemic and as we see lots of new resources being made available for housing, we need to be looking at it through a racial equity lens. So I feel like that's a big thing that again came through in this report.
John, any thoughts?
I would agree with what Gerry says. I usually agree with whatever Gerry says.
It's the safest thing to do.
Since I am from Amherst and think mostly about Amherst problems, it's interesting to see that in the larger context of the entire region. There are regional estimates, for example, of the shortage of housing. Well, 6 years ago, probably, we did a housing production plan. And at that point, our consultant estimated the unmet need for housing units at a few thousand. So we were already there, and things have not changed very much. And they are very slow to change. We have now 2 projects that I hope will be in the pipeline. One is waiting for a response from DHCD about funding. A second is another project where we're about to put out an RFP to identify a developer. Together, we're talking about maybe 80 to 90 units. And for any of these, from the day you start to think about the unit until the first tenant walks in the door is 4, 5, 6 years. The process is agonizingly slow. There are all kinds of hurdles that we put in place. And so just to get something off the ground takes a lot of effort and energy and an inordinate amount of time. So I think one thing we can think about is there any way to shorten that timeline, to move more quickly, to bring new units online?
Thanks, John. And going further north in our responses here, Linda, your thoughts on where we should focus our attention from the outset here?
Yeah, I came up with two things that I consider most urgent. And we come from a very rural perspective in Franklin County. And when I say we, I mean Franklin County, not the Franklin Regional Council of Governments. But two things are that we need to maintain and expand housing support services that help tenants find housing and help landlords feel comfortable and secure with their tenant choices. The COVID pandemic resulted in the expansion of the housing consumer education funding, and that has been really important and great. I assume for all three counties, but certainly for Franklin County. It's allowed us to have a full-time position, really helping tenants and landlords find and secure good choices for housing. And then we also have supplemented that with another grant that allows us to work specifically with individuals who've been incarcerated or are in recovery, and maintaining those housing support services, especially for populations that struggle to find housing, we think urgent. And the second thing is, I will echo what John said. We really need to expand housing development capacity now. That Franklin County has a shortage of housing now and is expected to have more in the future, and housing development takes years. We need funding to work with our towns to find suitable locations and gain support to attract developers to get a project from its genesis all the way through completion. And without more capacity, production of housing in Franklin County will continue to be slow and inadequate and ineffective. And I just want to take 30 seconds to explain why developing housing in Franklin County is hard. And one reason is because to fit in with our setting, our rural setting, our developments are pretty small, so we don't create economies of scale. We don't make a good business case for profit-driven developers. We have very few planners helping our towns with zoning. We have even fewer people who are expert in moving a project through the development process. And then state and federal grant programs often don't work. Federal programs we are either not urban enough and yet also not rural enough to be applicable. And state programs are often out of reach. We did a quick analysis of the program that funds development of a new affordable rental units between 2018 and 2021. $438 million was awarded. That was one 33 unit project in Franklin County received an award from that $438 million pot in that 4-year period.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks for bringing that to life in that way. Thinking and across the board here, John and Linda both bringing up production and the challenges around production as something that needs to be solved for. We have resources, as Gerry said. We're seeing them come in ways that in the past maybe we were only dreamed of now, and so we need to think about the production capabilities both on the developer side, but also we need the system to work in a way that allows us to really use those effectively during this time period. But I also appreciate the points on the people side of things here that you all raise around both racial equity and meeting the needs of people where they are, whether they need housing support services and other things to make housing matches or people in recovery. So we're not starting, as I mentioned in my comments, flat-footed here. We are doing things. You mentioned some projects that we have underway, things that we have done. As you think about some of the more successful efforts and things underway in the region, both even during the pandemic right now in the Pioneer Valley, what should we be? What should we use the resources that are coming forward now to scale up our solutions, to really invest in moving things forward, to solving some of the problems we've been working on for years? Gerry, do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I have thoughts specific to Springfield first, or primarily. I think some of the things that have been really helpful in Springfield, there's three. The first is infill homeownership. Homeownership is very affordable in Springfield. It's getting less so because there is so much demand for houses, for sale houses. So they go on the market and they're gone the same day with multiple offers. But over the last several years, we've been able to do a bunch of new homes, affordable homeownership. It's helped. We see it as one of the ways that we're helping to address the gap of homeownership between whites and Latinos and Blacks. The people who buy houses in Springfield, you know, that when we create these opportunities, are primarily people of color. So we're helping them get into a market where they have an asset that's growing. So that's been a real winner, I would say, for us. I think another thing is housing rehab. We were able to take some disaster money we were able to get after the tornadoes to pilot some programs where we're doing full home rehab, mostly grants, because people just don't have the money to be rehabbing their houses, and we're losing housing stock due to poor conditions. So we're doing full home rehab in 2 neighborhoods, and we would love to expand that and do it more throughout the city. A third success is, I will say it's in a slightly different realm, but I think it's important to point to, which is during the pandemic, the way we've been able to use non-congregate shelter to address street homelessness. We have moved virtually all of the unsheltered population off of the streets in Springfield by moving most of them into hotels. You know, we always knew that there were people who would not go to congregate shelter. And, you know, there is sort of a myth out there, they just don't want any help. We found that when we offered them hotel rooms, they went, and we're now really engaging them in housing search. And so it's been really a dramatic shift in how we've responded to homelessness. So those are the 3 Springfield things. One thing I'm sure probably John will speak to, but I just see as over the last 10 years even as a success for our region is affordable rental housing development that's starting to happen in suburban and out of the main urban areas. There's been some great successes around that.
Great. John, that seems like an opening for you there.
Well, it is and it isn't. We've had a little bit of recent development of affordable housing, or at least we have 2 projects in the pipeline, as I mentioned earlier. But for the moment, Keith, I want to focus on a major opportunity that people don't think of necessarily as an opportunity. The University of Massachusetts is in Amherst, and it has an enormous effect on the Amherst housing market. If you want to rent a one bedroom in Amherst, you're talking about $1,900 a month. A 2-bedroom could be $3,000 a month. So we're probably one of the most, if not the most expensive rental market in the Valley. Why is that? Well, it's because UMass has a certain number of units on campus, residential units, but it doesn't nearly serve their population. They are the largest landlord, certainly in Hampshire County, possibly in the Pioneer Valley. They have about 13,500 people that they serve at any time on campus, but they have 28,000 students enrolled. So there's a huge gap there. If the university were to add 3,000 to 5,000 new residential units on campus, it would not only affect the housing market in Amherst, but all throughout Hampshire County. The university used to have, and it's now been leveled so that they're going to rebuild it in part, not in whole, something called North Village, which was a place for family housing. And when North Village was being leveled or about to go down, there were hearings that the Amherst Town Council held. We heard testimony from people as far away as East Hampton about how difficult it is to find housing in Amherst for a family. And as I said, that reverberates not just in Amherst, but throughout Hampshire County. The governor has said that he wants to see a greater use of state property to meet his goals of expanding housing production. Well, one place to start would certainly be the Amherst campus, and I assume the other academic campuses around the state would offer similar opportunities. It would make an enormous change for us. And for us, I don't mean just Amherst, but I think the region, if there was much more housing available to students on the UMass campus, including students with families.
Great. Thanks, John. Linda, how does that look in Franklin County when you think about successful efforts that we could be scaling up with the new resources that are being made available?
Well, we actually are pretty hopeful right now that between this study that really highlighted the challenges in the Pioneer Valley and the rural policy plan, we think that between the two, there's going to be greater recognition of the challenges of developing housing in rural areas, and there will be more resources. So the state's economic development bond just included for the first time a rural development fund. We hope that we can use that to deal with issues that makes housing production more difficult here, like the need for water and sewer and sometimes even roads before we can think about building housing. But like Gerry, we also hope that either the Rural Development Fund or the American Rescue Plan may be flexible enough to allow us to pursue funding to work on rehab and to provide grants, not loans, to our homeowners with older housing stock to deal with making upgrades, basic health and safety upgrades, lead removal, asbestos removal, et cetera, to the older housing stock in Franklin County. And the other thing that Alyssa from our staff who's on this call is working on is she's put together a small town housing group and is really encouraging our towns to think creatively about how Community Preservation Act funds could be used for housing and whether there is a way for us to think regionally or sub-regionally and pooling our resources together to provide perhaps first generation home buyers with some down payment or closing costs to help bring more people to Franklin County. We need more people. We're a lovely place to live. You should all think about it.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Linda.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I'm going to go a little bit off script here for my panelists, but you also bring up something that I think is really interesting to consider here with the resources coming in is cross-jurisdictional coordination. Did I hear you just say that? I'm curious, as each of you all are representing different parts of the region and different jurisdictions. I think, for many who have worked in this field, and as Mark mentioned, our housing problems are regional, right? You're not going to solve them on your own, as John was just talking about in Amherst. But if you do some things in Amherst, like UMass builds 3,000 to 5,000 more units, it's not only going to help Amherst, it's going to help the whole region. So what do you all think about the potential of that, given that there are these new resources? There's an opportunity now to plan for them and perhaps ready ourselves, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, for an infrastructure bill that could be significant and investments for the next decade in housing like we haven't seen in generations. Is there a potential for us to work more regionally in terms of meeting the need rather than town by town, city by city?
I say yes.
I agree.
I'm not so sure, Keith. I made a reference to the Hampshire Council of Government a few months ago, and our town manager laughed because there no longer is a Hampshire Council of Government. It went out of business. The mechanisms to allow us to do that in government are not very strong. We do live town by town, and if something happens in Amherst that could affect Hadley or vice versa, the chances of being good communication, through existing channels which don't exist are pretty small. So I think we really need to rethink how we go about looking at regional problems, not just in an academic way, but in a practical political way. We don't have the mechanisms for governments to talk to each other very easily.
Yeah.
So there's a
Okay.
couple of things I want to point to. One, I think it speaks to the role of the state. You know, a lot of the funding went to the state, which is important because housing money, when it does come directly to localities, it comes to entitlement communities. So it means that a city like Springfield gets more money to build more affordable housing when actually we have very concentrated affordable housing in the neighborhoods where we have room to be building housing. And it would be helpful to build some of it in other places, but we can't use our funds for other places. So I think thinking about the way the money has come to the state and how we partner with the state to think about how do we think about, you know, where affordable housing, new affordable housing should sit within the region. That's one thing I wanted to mention. The other is there has been this really interesting thing that's been going on since September or so in response to the pandemic, that the Western Massachusetts Network to End Homelessness has been bringing together mayors and city staff along with nonprofits and other providers and legislators to have conversations every 3 weeks, which originally went to how are we making sure we have enough shelter to make sure that people can get off the streets during the pandemic, but is shifting now to start talking about how do we make sure that any of those people we got off the streets go into housing. So it's starting to be a housing conversation. And I know the 3-county continuum of care has brought together some developers and some town folks. And I've been having some conversations in Hampden County that go to, actually one of the things you mentioned, John, is how can we, well, if the usual development timeframe is 3 to 6 years, how do we do something faster? And what models are there? So, you know, what can we look at to do something that produces housing quickly? And how can we educate developers about that and bring them on board? And at the same time, recognizing that all affordable housing faces challenges around community opposition. So, you know, trying to get the buy-in from the get-go about how this is a regional need, and we need to be working throughout the region to be producing more housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, really
Go ahead.
quickly, I would say that I think John is right, that it's not easy, but I think it's possible, you know, recognizing that it does start locally and zoning must be in place to welcome housing. But I think there are many things we can do regionally. If we could improve our public transit system so that we recognize the nexus between housing and public transit. If we had better public transit in Franklin County to make development in Franklin County easier, more reasonable, a better option for people, that's an easy thing to do regionally. If we look at how to reduce our wastewater costs by the exciting project of getting a regional sludge dryer. Who wouldn't want a regional sludge dryer? And that would reduce our wastewater costs to make it easier for our municipalities to be more welcoming of affordable housing, for us to think about legislation that would allow us to pool some of our local revenue sources together to be able to think about what do we need as a region. We recognize the biggest problem for Franklin County going forward is our declining population and our aging population. We have to find a way to make Franklin County more welcoming, more available, more possible for people to live in our region.
So not easy, but important, and important to think about how we get there. What do we need enabling legislation? Do we need a different way of working with the state, with the resources that they'll also be getting? I think is a good point that's being raised here as well. There's money coming to entitlement communities that are significant, but it's coming to the Commonwealth overall. And shaping those resources to meet the needs of the opportunity that we see in our region, which are not the same as other regions in the state. And so I think part of the reason for the study was to make our needs clear. But I also think we need to be working to make our projects, our plans, our strategies clear, so that the state and other stakeholders know what to invest in and how to work with us, and to push on that front even more now, given that the opportunity that's before us. So on that note, I wanted to kind of, I had a question about that we've talked about a little bit in advance of this, about who needs to be at the table here. There's the good folks here on the screen with me, and many of you who are on the call today, in the meeting with us, who are already among the converted, right? You're among the coalition of the willing. Who else do we need at the table? My big one concern I have, I'll just throw out there, is that yes, there's all this great money coming in from the federal government. There could be even more coming in from an infrastructure bill. And who else needs to be there? Who else do we need to bring along with us and start working with, so that we can actually realize the full potential and that they can invest alongside? This shouldn't be about replacing money. This should be about building the money that we need to invest in these solutions that you all are talking about. Who else should be there?
Keith, I have a brief story. A good friend of mine who is an affordable housing not-for-profit developer was talking to someone in Amherst who is developing a new market rate housing project. And he tried to explain to him how including some affordable units would help him with the financing, as well as being the right thing to do. And the developer was seriously considering it. And then apparently he talked to his realtor and his banker, and they said, that's too much trouble. You really don't want to get into that business. And I think that's apocryphal. There are opportunities theoretically out there in which we could work with market rate housing developers, but this is not part of their business model. There are a couple of exceptions in the state, but by and large, we don't have the cooperation or the interest from people who do market rate housing. And that's a neglected opportunity. I don't know exactly how to change that, but it's obvious that that's something that needs to be addressed.
Any thoughts on who else needs to be at the table?
I think we need our schools, our regional transit authorities, our realtors, our businesses who need employees, our municipalities. And I just saw in the chat, not just the typical municipalities, but all of our municipalities. It really needs to be this group discussion and group effort. And I do think our state agencies and state partners need to be a part of the conversation. I know they're here today, but to really have an understanding of what's different in Western Mass, because it is different than the Boston area. And that story is sometimes hard to tell.
Gerry, any other thoughts from your end?
Add on about the state. I think the state has been doing some interesting things about putting carrots out there to communities to do more development.
Mm-hmm.
They have been very geared to the eastern part of the state because the numbers, to be able to participate, they require really high levels of housing development. And our towns are so small that we're even in the larger city, we don't meet those numbers. So it means, the programs don't get used at all out here. And I think those kinds of things that say to communities, here are some perks for producing more affordable housing, is some of the ways that we bring some of those other communities in. And I think the other, again, about the municipalities, but I think it's been interesting to see more municipalities come to the table to talk about homelessness. And I think education of some of the other municipalities about why affordable housing, and not only in the world of homelessness, but about jobs and about stability for kids in school and, all kinds of benefits to the community, why it's important and good for their community for them to be understanding it, so that when people object to projects, from leadership, there is a response about here's why we need this in our community.
Yeah. So we're going to now open it up. I know that there's been a active participation in the chat from some familiar names, as I see in the. So we're going to open up the chat to Q&A now. That's how we're going to use the chat. We're going to use it for Q&A. We've got over 100 folks on the call, so I don't want folks shouting out. But if you have a question, and that'll be for any of the folks who have been panelists or discussants today. So that means Gerry and Mark too. I know there were from the Donahue Institute. There may be questions about the data. Let me just say that what you saw was a selection of things and data available. It's in the phase 1 report on housing demographic and economic indicators for the region. There's a lot more data in the report itself. So I encourage you all. I think you can find it on the UMass Donahue website, and I'll put a link into it too from our website. You can find access to it, and the data should be also available now or soon at the Pioneer Valley data site as well. So we're trying to make sure and I know folks have also asked for the slides, and we will get those to you post event. But I wanted to open it up to questions. If you have a question, please put it in the chat.
Can I start with a question that
yes, you can. We'll give you that grace here, Linda, to start with a question. Go ahead.
I saw Peter's chat comment about whether there is truth that people, because of COVID, are leaving urban areas for rural and suburban areas. And I wonder, Mark and Gerry, if you guys have thought of a way to really determine whether that's true. We've seen anecdotally increase in housing prices, but we don't know if that means there truly is people leaving the Boston area for Franklin County or Hampshire County or Vermont. And how do we track that over time? Both, is it happening and are they staying?
So I think there's a couple things in there. One is, there's been a lot of anecdotal and kind of hot takes about how, and I've heard reasonable people all over the board about like, this is the death of cities versus, I saw Richard Florida give a talk like everything's going to be okay with cities. Obviously that's his cottage industry, and everything in between. And there's been some really interesting data that just came out in the last couple of days. The New York Times did an interesting piece with this, and others have been leveraging it using change of address forms to look at what kinds of patterns we've seen year over year and how we might tie that to the pandemic. Interestingly, patterns do seem to be fairly similar to what they were before, but with the exception of a couple of urban areas. So New York and San Francisco saw people moving outside of the urban core per se, but nearby metro. Boston saw a little bit of a decline as well. So I think that those are data that we might be able to leverage, and I'll defer to Gerry a little bit once we actually get what is possible with those data. But those were the first real data that I've seen that actually scratched at this question that everyone's asking. I would note a certain level of caution within this is, I feel like this is a question that we'll be analyzing for a few years, because I do think that once we settle into whatever the post-COVID world looks like, what does remote work look like? It was at the tip of people's tongues before about a solution to our transportation problems. And in a way, a solution to our housing problems too, when you think about Eastern Massachusetts and the pressure points about being close to Boston. Like, how does that change now if people are working from home 2 days a week permanently or something like that? And so it'll be interesting to think culturally what shifts we actually have. And I think it's going to take a little while for some of that to sort itself out. But to your simple question, Linda, there are at least some data finally that we can scratch at a bit and see what's happening, because up until this point, it's really been conjecture and real estate agents reporting out just on the relationship between price and supply, but which wasn't enough to really go on.
Yep.
So let me bring a question to the group from the chat. What roles can public housing authorities play? Folks have thoughts about that?
Our housing authority is a regional housing authority, and they have a huge role. They do our CDBG funding. They run our HCEC programs. They own housing. Its nonprofit affiliate is developing housing. And so for us, they are our go-to housing developer, housing manager, et cetera. But I think we're the only regional housing authority. Is that true? I see Denise Jordan nodding.
Yes, Denise
So
said yes.
Wayfinders is a regional housing authority.
Well, a regional administering agency, but we don't have, we're not a housing authority in the same way that Springfield Housing Authority is, or your what Linda is referring to. So we have some similar capabilities. Yeah. Other thoughts about housing authorities, and I think that's what public housing is, what people are really talking about. What role is there for public housing?
Well, one thing I will say, I mean, I think that what we see right in Springfield is lower rents, but lower income. I think we need, in order to have quality housing, we need to make up the difference. And that happens with housing vouchers. We have a lot of housing voucher use here. I think it's really helpful. I think though that it all gets concentrated in Springfield and Holyoke. That's not such a good thing. And so thinking about how we can bridge that gap throughout our region, there is, you know, some policy issues around small market area rents, which would make it easier to use vouchers in places other than Springfield. But I do think that is a way to partner with the private sector to solve housing affordability where there is housing.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on housing authorities? I'm trying to some people have lots to say here, but I'm trying to see if there are questions in what they're saying.
I'll just add, I'll add to what Gerry just mentioned, Keith. One of the things that we're having some problems with here at Springfield Housing Authority is just availability for voucher use. Because oftentimes folks have vouchers, they're nervous about losing that voucher because they're trying to look for housing in certain areas. Sometimes folks are reluctant to leave the city of Springfield and they don't want to venture out, and the housing stock is fairly low. And then for the amount of rents that's being asked for and the voucher amount, they don't always match. So we're seeing a lot of difficulty there in folks being able to, successfully use their vouchers to acquire housing in places that they want to reside in the city.
Thanks, Denise, for the cameo. Denise is also a member of the Housing Advisory Committee for the study. And here at Wayfinders as well, we see the same for our voucher holders. It's Gerry pointed out both the increasing rents, but the vacancy declining in the area. And right now it's been very hard, even though we have more vouchers available through things like the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, to really find housing for folks in the region where folks want to live. And we also work with the state on the UMass program, which helps people to move to other communities other than some of the communities that have been mentioned here, but more communities that the state has designated as places of quote unquote higher opportunity for some families. And that is a very tightly drawn map. So when we try to look at where folks can move, they can't move to everywhere with those vouchers. And even in places that people would think of as meeting some of the guidelines, for example, moving to Amherst is a very small area of Amherst that works, even though moving to Amherst might be something that families want to do, but they can't avail themselves of the benefits of that program everywhere in that community. So I think there are, and with the American Rescue Plan Act, there are new vouchers to be available there that will last through 2030. I'm hopeful that in the state budget there will be more MRVPs to go around as well. But we really do need to address this issue of more of breaking through to landlords. We certainly do lots of landlord education and other things, but really supporting people in that process of finding housing throughout the region continues to be through housing consumer education centers, as Linda was talking, and otherwise a big task. Trying to see if there are other.
Keith, if
Go
I
ahead,
can
Mark.
pop in with something while you look for questions. I mean, Charlie and Peter are prolific posters over here.
Yeah,
but I did see several comments or questions or statements around zoning, and I just wanted to acknowledge zoning's role in all of this too. And, and obviously the state has done a lot. It's been a long time coming around housing choice, which obviously is a great first step.
Yes.
But, I think that's one of the tension points, or not tension point, but, the conversation between affordable housing and housing that is affordable. And I think the increasing production of various types, particularly in communities that have limited zoning, where multi-unit or condos and apartments, they're less likely to be there. I mean, that is the role for those municipalities within a regional housing structure to help with production at various price points. And and then it ultimately ties back to what Linda was saying before about transportation. So it's like, if you have smaller units that are in apartments, that are in other communities, and you can come into Springfield still, or you can go into another part of the region. They all tie together, and I think that's an important part, statewide, about particularly in our suburban communities where it's pretty limited to large lots and single-family homes, and there's a lot of opposition to multi-unit housing. That's a big part of the regional story, and the reality is, for Massachusetts, it's build, build, build. We need more housing stock that is going to help with this functional issue that we have of being low and middle income in a high cost state. And, we're always going to have low income folks. We're always going to have middle income folks. But it's that quality of life question that ties back to the basic basket of goods of your life, and housing is one of them. And the better people's ability to better afford those things just means more for community stability long term.
Yeah, and Mark, one of the things that Linda brought this up as well, related to transportation, you just did as well. I think we need to think beyond housing, right? This is not just about housing in a silo by itself. This is housing amidst all the other challenges and opportunities that we have in our region to invest in. So it's, there was a question here about, a comment about, thinking about how we help people get jobs and maintain their employment and be able to train them for future opportunities. There's the investment in transit, which could be supercharged if the infrastructure bill goes through here in the region. And so, yes, there's the East-West Rail, but there is regional transit that is the real could be a real difference maker if we could expand that in ways that really reach places like Franklin County, or for that matter, rural or far out parts of any of the counties in the Pioneer Valley, which are not well served. And so I think, we need to think beyond our housing silo, and think about, again, as I asked the question, who else should be at the table, but think about all those other pots of money that are also already augmented through the American Rescue Plan, maybe further augmented either through the American Jobs Plan, otherwise known as Infrastructure Bill, or now the American Family Plan, if that happens, or other things that the federal government might do just now that there's a different administration in place and may target budget investments differently from their normal standard budget. So I do, and same thing at the state and local level. I feel like there's a real opportunity there for us to link arms with other folks who invest in communities to really think about how we bring those investments together in a way that gets us to one and one make more than two in that case, I think. I'm trying to see, there's a lot of comments here, but I'm trying to see if there are questions. Not seeing a whole lot of questions, but we're just about at time right now. So I do want to transition here to wrapping up, and if folks would hang in there with me for a moment. I hope you found today's discussion both informative and useful. I do have an ask for you. I did ask you in the beginning to think about kind of what you can do from your seat. And so as people of agency and capacity here, I challenge myself and all of you to seize this moment, to work together in many of the ways that we talked about. These are real things that we can do. We are the ones who can do them, many of us here. We are the ones who can encourage others to do them. We're talking about advocacy here. Somewhere in the chat here, I saw Tom Kegelman praising John Hornik here for his great work in Amherst and the need to replicate John's across the region to be able to have real conversations like the ones that happen in Amherst and in other cities and towns in the region. So we do need to work together in pursuit of that vision of an equitable, inclusive, and economically thriving region. So to that end, we will be sending out a survey so you get your feedback on this event. But we're also going to be asking if you're willing to remain engaged with us and thinking about what we could do, how we might work together, to hear more about as we're advancing phase 2 of the study, to keep you kind of posted on how we're doing there. But we also want to hear your ideas. So I really thank you all for being here today. Look out for that survey. Would really appreciate your responses to it and really appreciate your engagement. This is not the beginning, but it's not the end either. This is the moment that we must seize if we want to solve for some of these challenges and really live into that future that we talked about, that I outlined in the beginning. And in that way, we all benefit. So thank you for your time today. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to the great team at the UMass Donahue Institute for that great work and partnership throughout. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks for convening this.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice job.